Kia ora, welcome to the Cleine Line. I'm Jamie Cleine, Mayor of Bulla, and this podcast is a place for honest conversations about local government, life on the coast, and everything in between. This isn't the official council line, it's my personal take, with no spin, no script, just open reflections on what's happening in our communities, around the council table, and sometimes from the halls of Parliament too. In today's episode, we're diving into Westport's master plan, the one we've called Cutting Our Own Track. Now, this isn't just another council document, it's perhaps a turning point. It's about acknowledging the risks we face, but choosing action and not fear. It's part of future-proofing our town, not just physically, but socially and economically too. And we'll do it in a way that reflects Westport's character and our values. Let's start with the reality, because I think context matters. Now, we've been hit pretty hard. The floods of 2021 and 22 left some pretty deep scars, not just in infrastructure, but really in the town's confidence. And here's the hard truth. Westport is exposed. We sit on a river mouth, hemmed in by hills and sea, with legacy infrastructure that was never designed for today's climate reality. Our more recent floods don't tell the full story. Westport is flooded periodically over the entire recorded history of the town. Earthquakes have also proven parts of the town to be prone to liquefaction. And finally, we know climate change is impacting the frequency and intensity of weather events, and that eventually sea level rise will impact groundwater and the ability of soils to drain effectively. It really is what most would call a hazard stack, and it's pretty damn complicated. That's why we've stepped up with a strategy backed by evidence, by science, and by the people who live here. The foundation for this whole strategy became known as the Kawatiri business case. This business case was initiated after the 2021 flood, when the then local government minister requested we work together with West Coast Regional Council and our iwi partners on a comprehensive plan to reduce the hazard risk to Westport over time. It pulled together flood modelling, climate projections, economic data, and community input. It wasn't just about sandbags, flood walls, and insurance. It looked at what it would really take to protect Westport in the long term, and it made the case for investment of circa $50 million. The business case took some time to work through the cogs of central government, but in 2023, the Prime Minister announced a $22.9 million allocation for the Kawatiri business case. Not quite what we asked for, but a workable and substantial amount to work with. Locals will also provide a share through rates and business sponsorship to the tune of another $15 million. Off the back of that, we built what's called the Resilient Westport Work Programme, a coordinated set of actions across emergency management, infrastructure, master planning, and community well-being. The various actions within the program still sit both with West Coast Regional Council and Bulla District Council to deliver within their statutory roles. This program is what's helping us shift from short-term crisis mode to long-term strategic actions. We hear the word resilience a lot, but what does resilience really look like, and how has it been used in the Kawatiri business case? It's not just about building bigger walls, it's about making better choices about where and how we grow. And that's where the PARA framework comes in. And you'll hear this term a lot, and it stands for PROTECT, which is about building and strengthening flood defences where that makes sense. It's about avoiding, steering development away from high risk or high hazard risk areas. It's about retreat, enabling people to relocate over time where the risk has simply become too high, or accommodate, which is about adapting our existing buildings and systems to live with water or flooding or other hazards where that is necessary. So you see, the PARA framework is certainly not a one-size-fits-all approach. By applying it, as was done in the Kawatiri business case, you develop a suite of interventions designed to work in various timescales to ensure that you're taking the right action in the right place at the right time. Now, the Kawatiri business case, of course, was guided by community input and solid information from our technical, engineering, and river modelling teams. That hopefully gives you a snapshot of how the Resilient Westport Work Programme came to be, and there's clearly a number of elements within it, which will be great for future podcasts to take a deeper dive. It's certainly interesting, complex work, and some really big projects sit within that. But today, I'll talk a little bit more about the Buller District Council-led master planning work, Cutting Our Own Track. Well, first off, let's take a moment to acknowledge what I think is a pretty big win. At this year's Local Government New Zealand conference, Cutting Our Own Track, the Westport Master Planning work, took out the National Super Idea Award. This was a major recognition, not just for the quality of the master plan, but the boldness of what we're trying to do. We weren't just up against small towns, this was a national field, and what won it? A clear community-led plan grounded in reality that shows how a town like Westport can take control of its future, and that's something that we should all be really proud of. The master plan itself was a long and complex project with more than 130 community stakeholders attending workshops and providing their input over 7 or 8 months. Project lead for the work was Paul Zarnin of the Buller District Council. I caught up with Paul to talk through some key elements of the project. So the master plan is a key element of the Resilient Westport Work Programme. So can you talk me through what the project brief to the Isthmus Group was?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think upfront it's really important to always remember that this is part of an integrated work project as well. So while the protection measures are being undertaken, this is a much longer sort of window and looking at, well, what are the problems in Westport above and beyond flood protection in itself? Are there other hazards that we need to take into account? And also, what are some of the social indicators? So what's happening with deprivation, future employment options as well. So in the early days, when the line item came through in the para framework, there was this question around the scope of the master plan. Is it simply a hazard response or is it something much wider than that? This is sort of a once-in-a-generation opportunity to start looking at planning the future. So the scope that we gave to Isthmus, we actually went a lot wider. So rather than just looking simply at Alma Road and looking at the zoning changes that were being proposed there, we started looking at the demographic capabilities in Westport, started looking at potential future industries as well. So we went literally to a master planning stage rather than a spatial plan. So a spatial plan would look at, an area to subdivide, where this looked at future employment opportunities, future industries, growth areas for the district, while still being really honest about the sort of hazard stack that Westport faces as well.
Awesome. So what does sort of good look like? What is it we're trying to achieve with master planning and the approach that's been taken here?
This is something, because it's such a long-term project, it's got to be a living document. What we decide in 2025 might not be relevant in 2040. So we refer to this as a conceptual framework. So we say, what does good look like now is to start opening areas for growth that are largely free from natural hazards. So it allows people, I guess, opportunities in terms of where they want to develop as well. For me personally, what does good look like is that we start bending the curve. And that means we start looking at the forecasts of infometrics that says we've got an aging, declining, and a population that's really going to struggle economically if we don't start looking at diversification. So for me, this is, I guess, the mechanism or the tool that starts looking at different employment opportunities, different business growth opportunities, and also, to be honest, some growth at the district as well, which I think is vitally needed if we want to try and keep rates in a reasonable level. So good to me looks like a planning exercise that actually tackles all the well-beings.
So in terms of the process that the Isthmus team led here in Westport, I know it was quite a unique and over several months. So what was kind of the approach taken to develop Cutting Our Own Track?
So most councils tend to approach something like hazard management. They go out to the community and they say, here are all the hazards that you are facing. And it kind of installs this shock and horror approach to people. And it gets a bit of a fight or flight instinct. You feel really under threat when you see that. So we took a design-based approach and a participatory design-based approach. So we reached out to a network of people in Westport. So it was quite an organic process as to who's who in the zoo, who had connections into Westport, what demographics were they kind of involved in. And then we started putting these different groups together and saying, well, why don't we actually invite people into a neutral space? We have ISMIS lead the design process, and we ended up doing a series of design weeks. I do at this point want to acknowledge that even with all of the engagement after those design weeks, that there's a lot of people we haven't talked with in Westport yet. And I think from a project team perspective, that is something we've continually said, is this is going to go on for a very long time, and we make an obligation to go back out to the community at every step and stage to bring people into that journey. But for us, we had 185 different people that we directly approached and said, look, we're going to be running this master planning exercise. It's a government-funded initiative. This is a really good moment to start putting best foot forward. So we ran a series of 5 design weeks. Each of those design weeks had a series of workshops in it. And we went through, everything from the landscape that we live in, what the hopes, the visions and aspirations for the community were as well. And so all up, the people that contributed all of their time actually ended up putting in, sort of 50, 60 plus hours each individual. And that was a way to try and get locals to provide input to a design process of what the future looks like. So rather than sort of scurrying into the background and having a bunch of urban designers and subject matter experts come up with a plan, this one is anchored in local knowledge. So it was an 8.5-month process, which is still quite quick. And I guess that's the point of this isn't going to stop. This is something that needs to go on. Community development doesn't have a start or a stop point. It's something that's iterative and ongoing as well.
So some of the work that actually dropped out of that, and it's been included in the plan around like the key concepts. So so out of all of that community engagement and the sort of input from the experts, if you like, what sort of the key concepts that the plan kind of seeks to kind of cover off?
One of the big things was that 95% of the people that attended those workshops actually turned around and said, hey, we've got a bunch of hazards here. We need to start opening areas up for growth. And under a worst case scenario, so think something like Christchurch, where there was significant liquefaction and people couldn't live in those areas, we need to think in advance of opening these areas up. So one of the big things we did was a land identification project, and that was anchored in viability, compatibility, and desirability. And they all had different matrix and scoring under it to go, what's the best place close to town that we can actually start opening up areas that aren't that vulnerable? So one of the key sort of anchors is looking at some of the Pamu land or land court land. It's up Pakahi Road, just by the rifle range there, and saying this is actually a really ideal space that we could start opening up for growth at some point in time. We looked at Westport itself and the main street and started looking at some of the history in terms of the revitalisation project that had been undertaken and building on that in terms of some of the main street initiatives. How do we activate the main street that we have today as well? In terms of the big picture of opening up a new area for growth, this isn't really council business as usual. So one of the sort of key activities that was mentioned is setting up a thing called a special purpose vehicle. So this is the thing that controls the release of land over time over some of that land corp or Pamu land. So traditionally, I guess when areas go for growth, it is all private sector led. So you buy a chunk of rural real estate, you go for a plan change, and the value increases substantially from rural to residential. In this case, we're saying, well, hold up, is this a way that we can actually subsidise some security over time for the community of Westport? That under a worst case scenario, if there are hazards that show up over time, it's not going to break the bank essentially for people to move from point A to point B if and when required. So the documentation is all up online. It's all publicly accessible. The workshop content is up online as well under resilientwestport.co.nz. So it gives people a good snapshot to sort of go, what were the questions we asked? What were the analytics that went in behind it? And what are some of the key moves that sit within that cutting our own track?
Awesome. And so I guess it's fair to say then that cutting your own track is actually pretty much the start of what's potentially a really long journey and complicated with a number of stakeholders across private sector, government, central government, local government to really bring this thing to life in the coming years.
Absolutely. And it's got to be anchored in the Westport community. It's something I've said over and over. If this is a plan that is owned by Westport and for Westport, then we'll see those results come out over a long period of time. It is complicated, but this builds on previous work as well. It also looks at the 2100 report and the recommendations that came out, where it said, hey, look, over the next 20, 40, 60, 80 and 100 years, there will be different hazards that show up in Westport. That doesn't mean we need to go screaming and running for the hills as such, but it does mean we need to have a plan in place. Any plan like this is always going to take a long time, but if anything that all the case studies have shown us, it's better to be prepared for a best and a worst case scenario than just having those happen to you. So in this case, Westport gets to make a series of decisions to look ahead of some bravery and some confidence as well, and dashed in a good amount of optimism. But yeah, it isn't an easy project or process, but we don't need to rush these things. We need to look really carefully at Westport as it stands and make sure that we don't end up in a space of maladaptation. So sort of seeing people take equity losses or etc. So we're bringing the Insurance Council on board, we're bringing the finance sector on board, and all those different government agencies. But the core and key component of this is that this is a plan for Westport and by Westport.
Great to hear from Buller District Council project lead there, Paul Zarnin, from a very noisy Wellington airport. I think Paul explained it really well, the level of community input into developing this master plan and the many threads and stakeholder groups that are going to have to be woven together in order to make master planning work in the coming decades. Most importantly, of course, is the community, and there'll be many touch points along the way through council and other processes as the master plan comes to life in coming decades. Work continues on the next steps in the master planning project, with discussions progressing with Pāmu Farms, who own the target farmland, the Insurance Council of New Zealand, the Natural Hazards Commission, the Ministry for the Environment, and the Climate Change Commissioner, all taking an active interest in this work and how it may be applied to other areas in New Zealand. If you want to know more about the master planning work itself or the broader Resilient Westport Work Programme, you can check out the resilientwestport.co.nz website. There is screeds of information about how we got to where we are now, the progress on the hard flood protection structures themselves, and any updates on the master planning. I'll end the podcast on some reflection from the workshops of the master planning itself, where one of the questions posed was what makes a great ancestor? And it does make you think when you're in a position of decision making, have you made the right call, and what will our future generations in 50 or 100 years' time make of the decisions made or perhaps not made by local and central government as you look back? Ask yourself, what does make a great ancestor? That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening to the Cleine Line. This podcast is here to spark conversation, share a bit of insight, and shine a light on the things that matter to Buller. But I also want to hear what matters to you. If there's an issue you'd like my thoughts on, someone in the community we should feature, or a topic you think deserves some airtime, send me an email, jamie@theclineline.com. I'll be back next time with more updates, reflections, and what's been happening around the district. Until then, thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk again soon.